Bernita Sims White was born February 3, 1960. She was described as a lovely woman with a beautiful soul. She married Artis White, lived in Lansing, Michigan, and the couple had 2 daughters, Elena and Michelle. However, the marriage wouldn't last, and in May of 2001, Bernita filed for divorce. Artis was a state police sergeant and was allegedly having at least one marital affair. After filing for divorce, Bernita sought full custody of their daughters. However, Artis threatened to release a videotape he had of her at a motel with another man unless Bernita agreed to joint custody of their daughters. That same day, the judge ruled in favor of joint custody. Bernita had told people that she was afraid he would kill her, and she believed he had been eavesdropping in on her phone conversations. Then, a week later, on June 22, 2001, Bernita filed court papers accusing her husband of hiring a private investigator to follow her after she filed for divorce. The next day, Bernita and her 5-year-old daughter, Michelle, would go to the Potter Park Zoo to attend a birthday party at the picnic area in which Artis was present. Artis would leave first, and Bernita and her daughter would remain in the park a bit longer. It was at this time that Bernita was fatally shot. Police later determined that the fatal shot came from a high-powered rifle north of the park about 100 yards away. The zoo and park closed the rest of the day and the next as Lansing and Michigan State police officers, detectives, and dogs combed the area for clues. Attention soon began to focus on her husband, a Michigan State police trooper. Artis White was questioned, but never charged in connection with her murder. He later admitted to using police databases, such as the Law Enforcement Information Network, to check on his wife and her acquaintances, but was never charged for doing so. The Lansing police detective who investigated the case alleged that Artis White had a motive and may have contracted someone to kill his wife. While Artis never admitted to such a thing, he did admit to hiring a private investigator to follow his wife after she filed for divorce from him. Although White is not suspected of pulling the trigger, police believe he may know the shooter. Tragically, upon hearing that her daughter had been killed, Bernita's mother, 67-year-old Barbara Sims, died of a heart attack the same day as Bernita. A year after her death, Artis filmed a documentary about people being wrongly accused of crimes and would later author a book titled Who Killed My Wife? As of today, Artis White has been the only suspect in the murder of Bernita, but he has maintained his innocence and this case remains unsolved. Sky Elijah Metalwala was born September 6, 2009 to Julia and Solomon. Both of Sky's parents were immigrants to the United States, with father Solomon Metalwala being originally from Pakistan and his mother Julia Buryakova being from Ukraine and born in Soviet Russia. She would meet Solomon in 1997 when she was only 15 years old and he was 21. When she finished high school in 1999, they bought a condo in Bellevue, Washington. Despite a tumultuous relationship, they got married in 2003 in a brief ceremony in his mother's kitchen. Later, she said his family gave her the choice of either going through with the marriage or never seeing him again, since they claimed he was facing deportation, and by marrying him, he could stay in the United States. Within the first 2 years of marriage, they began having financial problems when a competing deli opened next to their restaurant and it began cutting into their earnings. In 2007, the couple had their first child, a daughter named Miley, and then 2 years later, Sky was born. Solomon claimed that Julia began exhibiting psychological problems, causing the family to start eating outside and sleeping on the floor to comply with her obsession with keeping the condo clean. She would obsessively clean their home for hours every day, 7 days a week. Neighbors in the condo often complained of hearing vacuuming in the middle of the night. Solomon stated that Julia said she wanted to kill herself so often that even their little girl Miley began to say it. When Sky was 2 months old, his parents left him alone in their car in a Target parking lot when the temperature was below freezing. Both parents were then arrested after police had them paged to their car and then charged them with reckless endangerment. The Metalwalas claimed they had been inside for only 20 minutes and did not want to wake the child, but the store's security camera video footage showed that it was actually closer to an hour. In 2010, Julia was briefly committed to a mental hospital for the first of 3 times after telling Solomon she had dreamed of killing the children, specifically strangling Sky. There, she was diagnosed with severe OCD, which she continued to deny having. However, psychiatrists did not believe that rendered her unfit to parent a child. Shortly after she got out, Solomon filed for divorce. After the couple separated, Julia texted her husband claiming she wanted to commit suicide, which she later claimed she had done just to get his attention. When she was finally committed for a 3rd time, she was found to be a danger to herself and others. After showing improvement and being released, Solomon and his brother took her to the University of Washington Medical Center where she checked in voluntarily. While she was there, their lender foreclosed on their condo, and Solomon moved with their children to its parents' home in Kirkland, Washington. The couple began a very ugly divorce process and a bitter custody battle. Julia alleged that Solomon had been abusive and that she feared for her life. Solomon claimed that the allegations were fabricated and said Julia's mental problems made her unstable, incapable of keeping food in the house, or letting her children sleep in their beds due to her OCD. Child Protective Services investigated a claim that Solomon had sexually abused his daughter, but ruled it unfounded. However, Solomon was prohibited from seeing his children for a year while the case was investigated. At different times in the case, both spouses sought protection orders against each other. In September 2010, the court surprisingly awarded Julia full custody of both children. She then refused to let them see Solomon, who did not have any visitation rights. Solomon continued to press the issue in court, along with some other issues such as property they both owned. Julia offered to forego alimony and child support if he let her move to Arizona with the children, but he refused. These disputes continued for over a year. In November 2011, the court hearing the case ordered the couple into a week of mediation to resolve their issues. The session was reportedly a success, with the two eventually agreeing that Julia would have custody of both children while Solomon had full visitation. However, on November 3rd, shortly after the agreement had been signed, Julia called her lawyer and said she had felt pressured into the new agreement and decided to void it. On November 6, 2011, Julia said Sky was sick and she was driving him and his 4-year-old sister to Overlake Hospital Medical Center when the car she was driving ran out of gas in the 2600 block of 112th Avenue Northeast. Julia then left Sky strapped in a car seat in the unlocked vehicle, took his sister, and walked to a gas station a mile away for help in the cold. When she arrived, she didn't buy gas or ask for help, but instead called a friend who dropped her off at the car about an hour after she'd left it. Although she claimed she was taking him to the hospital, she did not have her wallet, purse, or phone with her. By the time her friend brought her back to the car, Sky was gone and has never been seen again. Julia did not have a gas can with her when she called the police at 9:50 a.m. to report her son's disappearance. Police learned that the car had not in fact run out of gas and had no mechanical problems. Witnesses said they'd seen the car between 8 and 10 a.m. and there wasn't a child in it. Julia refused to take a polygraph test or speak directly to the police about her son's disappearance and communicated through an attorney instead. The rest of Sky's family members, including his father, Solomon, cooperated with the investigation, and Solomon has been active in the search for Sky, whereas Julie has not been. Investigators learned no one besides Julia had seen Sky for at least 2 weeks before his disappearance, and possibly much longer than that. But it wasn't uncommon for her to isolate herself in her home with the children for extended time periods. She also habitually left the children alone in the house, notably for 11 hours a few days before Sky's disappearance, while she went through the long mediation session regarding child custody. The night before Sky went missing, an episode of Law & Order Special Victims Unit was aired in which a mother tries to cover up the death of her child by claiming he was abducted from a parked car. Law & Order was reportedly Julia's favorite TV show. Strangely, on her Facebook page, she had posted many pictures of their daughter Miley, but almost none of Sky. Investigators stated that they did not believe her story and later said that the decision not to charge her was a strategic decision. Following Sky's disappearance, his sister was taken into protective custody and placed in a foster home. His sister was too young to provide any statements useful to the investigation. She only said her brother had been in the car that morning. Solomon was allowed supervised visitation with her and after 6 weeks got custody of his daughter, and she was given no visitation rights. In March 2012, Solomon and Julia's divorce agreement was finalized. About 3 years after Sky's disappearance, Julia married Alan Morgan and gave birth to another son. Their marriage was troubled with incidents of domestic violence, and Morgan was jailed for violating a no-contact order against Julia. He continued to violate the order by making at least a dozen phone calls to her from jail. Child Protective Services sought custody of the baby, alleging that both Julia and Morgan were unfit parents. If Sky is alive, it is believed that she let someone else take him and made up the story of his disappearance. Solomon said he believed that his son was alive, but perhaps not in the United States. He recalled that her estranged father came from Ukraine to visit her. Solomon wondered if the older man could have taken the boy back to that country with him at the time. However, Solomon's attorney personally believes that Sky is no longer alive and states Solomon does not like to hear that theory. For the past 10 years, Julia has refused to speak to police regarding her son's disappearance. In June of 2021, she was arrested for stealing clothes from a Costco. Surprisingly, no one has been charged in Sky's disappearance, and as of today, this case remains unsolved. Valerie Pride was an Arizona native with a large family that consisted of 5 sisters and 1 brother. She went to South Mountain High School and Arizona State University. She worked at Palo Verde Nuclear Plant as the first black female electrician at the company. Valerie loved to rollerblade and also spend time with her friends and kids. On September 6, 1982, at 10 p.m., Valerie and her daughters, 8-year-old Shantia and 4-year-old Duana, were at their home on 1545 East Ardmore Road in Phoenix, Arizona. Meanwhile, Valerie's live-in boyfriend, Ben Daniels, was sadly at the hospital dealing with the tragic death of his 9-year-old daughter from another relationship. His daughter, Zena, had drowned in a bathtub during a seizure at her mother's home about a mile away. This was not the only tragedy he would endure that day. As he arrived home, he would shockingly find Valerie and her daughters, 8-year-old Shantia Marquette Pride and 4-year-old Duana Lynn Pride, were all stabbed to death. Investigators believe the killer left through the backyard and climbed over the wooden fence to escape, leaving a patch of blood on the wooden rails before crossing the yard of an abandoned home. The killings apparently occurred within 30 minutes of the time Ben returned home and found the bodies. Valerie had been on the phone with Ben's brother at 9:30 p.m. and got off the phone to answer a knock at the door. Neighbors reported they heard a commotion at the house about 9:45 and the bodies were found at 10 p.m. Neighbors also heard Ben's screams after he arrived home and called the police. Police said Valerie's body was found in the kitchen and the bodies of the 2 girls were found in the living room huddled together near a love seat dressed in pajamas. However, the murder weapon was never found. Police said the girl's father, Jimmy Pride, became hysterical and had to be restrained after he arrived at the house around 11 p.m. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no signs of forced entry, and nothing was taken from the home. Police believed there was a tie between the killings and a burglary that had happened in the home the month prior in August of 1982. A waterbed had been slashed and Valerie's clothes dumped into the water. Detectives followed hundreds of tips and conducted about 1,000 interviews from California to Ohio. In August of 1983, nearly a year later, police detained 14-year-old Kevin Lee Atkins and announced they were seeking a second juvenile and at least 1 adult. However, Atkins was released the next day and was never charged with anything related to the murders. Officials at the time said the murders may have been an act of revenge involving the death of Zena Daniels, as Atkins was Zena's cousin. Sadly, as of today, this case remains unsolved. Mindi Chambers was born May 28, 1965, to a life of tragedy. When Mindi was a toddler, her mother, Mary Chambers, was found murdered in the bathtub of her apartment at 26 Roland Street in Yonkers, New York in 1968. Mindi was only 3 years old at the time, and police believe Mindi's father, Alan, was the suspect, but he was never charged due to lack of evidence, despite him having scratches all over his face and arms. Soon after Mary's murder, Alan would be sentenced to prison for assault and attempted rape of another woman. Mindi would then go to live with Alan's mother, Irene, in Chandler, Arizona, and then when she died, Mindi would go to live with her aunt, Karen. In 1972, when Mindi was 7, Alan was released from prison and took back custody of her despite being a murder suspect and having been in prison for violent acts. In 1982, at the age of 17, Mindi, who was a student at Mountain View High School, would call Child Protective Services and tell them that her father had been molesting her for the past 5 years. Police reports show that CPS called him about the accusation 6 days later and he hung up on them. In response, Child Protective Services placed her in the custody of her stepmother, Patricia Chambers, who was in the process of a divorce from Alan. 3 days later, Mindi would go missing. On October 19, 1982, she was last seen in Tempe, Arizona, when she left her apartment at 2141 East University Drive and walked her 2 stepsisters, Misty and Alicia, to school. When her stepsisters returned home, Mindi was gone and the front door was open. There were no indications of a struggle, and her purse, identification, and other belongings were still inside the apartment. A clerk in a Circle K convenience store on the corner of University and Prince in Tempe, Arizona, reported seeing Mindi on the day of her disappearance. He reported that he saw Mindi making a phone call on a payphone, and then a green and tan station wagon pulled into the parking lot and the driver grabbed Mindi and forced her inside. The employee was friends with Mindi's stepmother, and it's unknown if he only told her of the incident or had notified the police as well. Later, Mindi's half-sister would report that Alan drove a green station wagon at the time of her disappearance. Her stepmother attempted to report her missing, but since she had run away several times in the past, police did not take her serious. Sadly, an official missing persons report wasn't filed until April of 1995 by her Aunt Karen, 13 years after her disappearance. Her relatives stated she had a history of running away, and they thought she had simply walked out of her life to escape her problems. Also, CPS apparently dropped their investigation into her father a short time after Mindi went missing. In 1984, on New Year's Day, partial remains were found in a pasture south of Interstate 10 at the Highway 1132 overpass in Vidor, Texas. It was determined to be that of a female aged 12 to 20, and the facial reconstruction closely resembled Mindi. The Jane Doe and Mindi had both wore braces, had brown hair, and were Caucasian females. However, it could not be proven to be Mindi. Mindi's half-sister even offered her own DNA to test, but there was an issue. Investigators needed paternal DNA instead, but testing of her father, Alan Chambers, wasn't an option. He had died in an accident when he fell asleep, causing his truck to run off the road, overturn, and eject him from the vehicle near Goochland, Virginia, on December 13, 1994. Unfortunately, he was cremated, and therefore DNA could not be obtained to compare to the remains of the Jane Doe. The remains were later ruled out as belonging to Mindi, and as of today, she has never been found, and this case remains unsolved. Kaila Morris was born December 16, 1988, to Bonnie and Andy Morris. Sadly, in 2002, her father passed away from leukemia. When Kaila was about 14 years old, her mother Bonnie would remarry to Robert Butch Triplett. Kaila was described as very shy, kind, responsible, and a homebody that loved to read. She also loved animals and did not like to be in large crowds. When Kaila was 20 years old, she owned a condo in Starkville, Mississippi, which she shared with her stepbrother Trey and English Bulldog Tonka. She was also attending classes part-time at Mississippi State University and working at the cookie store at a mall in Columbus, Mississippi. She had one close friend named Labriska Walker who had an infant son, and she would often spend time with the both of them. On September 17, 2009, her mother, Bonnie, was out of state on vacation in Florida, and Kaila was at her mom and stepfather's home in Columbus, Mississippi with her stepfather, Butch. The home was located on Golding Road in a remote area with little to no cell phone service. On the evening of September 17th, Kaila's stepfather, Butch, said he saw Kaila rummaging through her purse in the passenger seat of her car. He says he then went to the bathroom about 8 p.m., and that's when he claims he heard a vehicle coming up the gravel driveway. He said he heard some talking outside, and then Kaila called into the house to tell him her plans and with whom she was leaving, but he couldn't hear her well and didn't understand everything she said. She said she was going to do something, and then she was going to see Labriska and the baby. Butch said Kaila then left the home, and when he looked out the window, he saw a dark SUV or van leaving, but he did not see the driver or any other passengers. Strangely, about 15 minutes later, Labriska arrived at the triplet home looking for Kaila. Labriska said she wasn't expecting Kaila to come to her home, which was located about 30 minutes away in Carrollton, Alabama. Her showing up wasn't unusual because the two would visit each other several times a week, often arriving unannounced. The family became concerned about Kaila's whereabouts the next afternoon after her mother, still in Florida, chatted with Labriska via Facebook. They realized something was very wrong when Labriska said she had not seen Kaila and said she never returned home to care for her beloved dog Tonka. Bonnie then asked Butch to report Kaila missing while she flew home. Strangely, when investigators searched the home, they discovered her shoes, keys, purse, and cell phone still inside the home, which one would think you would bring if you were going across the state line to visit a friend. She last used her cell phone at 3:44 p.m., 4 hours before her stepfather reported her leaving. Also, Kaila was known to not like to be a passenger in a vehicle and did not have a known friend that drove a dark-colored SUV or van. Her mother says Kaila was very close to her family, and the two talked 3 or 4 times a day, either on the phone or via Facebook. 5 days after her disappearance, a judge ordered a search warrant of the triplet home and authorized the seizure of specific items. Over a period of weeks, there would be 3 different search warrants issued. Bonnie mentioned to the investigators that Butch had recently changed the hard drive in his computer. Just 2 weeks after Kaila disappeared, Butch was found to be in possession of child pornography and was arrested and charged with exploitation of children. His home computer was searched during the investigation of Kaila's disappearance and was found to have a history of sex-related crimes in both Mississippi and Louisiana. His home and land were searched by search teams with cadaver dogs but found no sign of Kaila. Butch was already on probation for a 2003 attempted sexual battery charge 6 years before Kaila went missing. He was also found guilty of forcible rape in Covington, Louisiana in December 1997 and sentenced to serve 6 years in prison. Those charges were remanded for hearing in 2001 and reduced to simple battery, but after the victim in the case refused to testify, the charges were dismissed. During his trial for possession of child pornography, the state expert witness testified that Butch had over 4,000 images of child pornography on his computer. Butch later took the stand and adamantly denied owning the child pornography. He consented that at one point in time he had an extensive collection of pornography, but maintained he thought the girls were of legal age. He was later found guilty and sentenced to 40 years in federal prison as a habitual offender at the age of 61. During an interview, he admitted to washing Kaila's bedsheets the last night she was seen, stating that she said they were dirty. He also told investigators that Kaila asked him to check the family-owned property in Alabama for unknown reasons. When he went to the property, he took an axe and a shovel, and in his 4-wheeled vehicle, he claimed to get stuck for 2 hours. In questioning by the FBI, Butch admitted to inappropriately touching Kaila and said he had massaged her while she was topless and pulled her sleeping shorts down. He told investigators his wife was present at some of the massages, but she was absent during others. He told investigators he would turn away when Kaila removed her shirt, although he admitted to kissing her on the lips at least twice. When the second time he kissed her, it appeared she did not like it. Butch said he stopped and did not do it again. He asked the federal judge to throw out the child pornography conviction because he said his lawyers did not do a good enough job on his defense. He also claimed that Lowndes County deputies did an illegal search when they found sexual images of children on his computer. Early in the investigation, Kaila's mother stated that she doesn't believe Butch would have harmed her daughter because of her love for her and how important she was to her. She said her husband has never been anything but kind and gentle to her family. It is unknown if she still feels this way. As of today, Kaila has never been found, and Butch remains in federal prison on the unrelated charges. Tiahease Tawana Jackson was born October 5, 1972, and grew up in Staten Island, New York. She was described as a street-smart kid and had been taught not to trust strangers. In the summer of 1983, at the age of 10, Tiahease and her mother Gwendolyn Jackson and 3 siblings were living temporarily at the Conca Dora Motel in Mariners Harbor on Forest Avenue of Staten Island. They had been displaced after a fire burned them out of their apartment, and the motel would become one of the last places Tiahease was seen. On August 14, 1983, her mother was reportedly taking a nap around 1:30 p.m. when another resident of the motel asked Tiahease to go to a local market to get them a pack of chicken wings. This was not uncommon as she often went on errands in the city by herself. As her mother slept, she went to the Crown Supermarket in the 900 block of Richmond Avenue and was reportedly last seen inside of the store. Sadly, she would never return. When her mother awoke at 4:30 p.m. and saw that she was not home, she immediately began searching for her daughter, but was unable to find her. Tiahease had several medical illnesses, including Bright's disease, which is a kidney disorder that requires medication, asthma, high blood pressure, diabetes, as well as learning disabilities. During the investigation, there was a man that kept coming up by the name of Andre Rand, and it was speculated that he may have had something to do with her disappearance. Rand's name has been mentioned in several documentaries, including the 2009 film Cropsey, which was about a boogeyman-like figure who was a well-known Staten Island urban legend. In 1988, Rand was convicted for the abduction of Jennifer Schweiger, a 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome that went missing in July of 1987 after she went for a walk and never returned. A month later, her body was discovered in a shallow grave on the grounds of the former Willowbrook State School, now the College of Staten Island. Rand, who had a makeshift campsite nearby, was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the abduction, but a Staten Island jury could not reach a verdict on the murder charge in the case. He was also convicted of the 1981 abduction of 7-year-old Holly Ann Hughes, who disappeared during her trip to the store to purchase soap for her mother. At his sentencing 20 years later, he launched into a rambling, half-hour monologue in which he denied guilt, professed his love for older and lonely women, and invited the female jurors to correspond with him. Rand's real name is Frank Rashan, and he is diagnosed with an intellectual disability. He was a drifter who worked odd jobs and lived in boarding houses and in makeshift campsites around the island. At the time of her disappearance, he lived at a campsite in Barrenhurst Cemetery, which is less than a half mile from the motel where Tiahease and her family were staying. Gwendolyn told investigators that she saw a man matching his description, often hanging out in the motel's parking lot in a van. In fact, investigators did question Rand 3 days after Tiahease's disappearance, but never brought charges due to a lack of witnesses and evidence. He is also considered a suspect in many other cases, but authorities lack evidence to charge him. He served time for sexually assaulting a 9-year-old Bronx girl in the early 1970s and for driving a group of children to New Jersey without their parents' permission in 1983. He was known to prey on the weak, as many of his victims were mentally or physically challenged. He is currently eligible for parole in 2037 at the age of 93. Gwendolyn Jackson eventually relocated to her native Georgia with her remaining 4 children. 25 years later, in 2008, the motel that was located at 2232 Forest Avenue was torn down to make way for a shopping strip. Also in 2008, her mother Gwendolyn passed away, never knowing what happened to her daughter, and as of today, this case remains unsolved.